This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. You can buy, sell, and trade cryptocurrencies on Uphold. You can also trade precious metals and equities. They have 10 plus million users, 250 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. As with all exchanges, you can buy and sell on them, but I highly recommend you custody your own crypto, not your keys, not your coins. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is attorney John Deaton. John, it's great to have you back on.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate always being on with you.
John, I know you're a busy man. You got lots going on. Thank you for taking the time to do this. This morning, you actually spoke at a crypto hearing within the state of Maine. Tell us a bit about that and the premise behind that.
Yeah, well, it was very quick. It was the first hearing on anything to do with digital assets in Maine. And what you had is a state senator, all right, who was a senator in the state of Maine, who basically proposed a bill that simply said that specialty financial institutions, certain private financial institutions, should be allowed to custody crypto, Bitcoin and other crypto, and maintain 100% reserves. Okay, so nothing to us in the crypto world, this is nothing that is a big deal, right? But when you go to that hearing and you watch it, your mind's going to explode, Tony. And what I mean by that is something that you've said many times in the last 5 years, which is we are early. Do you know those words, right? We are early. When you hear the questions, and for me, there was a fellow that went first and they spent a lot of time with him, and then they got behind schedule, so they limited to I did 3 minutes and then they moved on. But it was fascinating and disappointing in many ways to listen to the questions. Sure. These are people who are state legislatures, right? As opposed to Congress. This isn't federal, this is state. So these are people who have full-time jobs and they're like a state senator, right? Or a state congressman. And they're not crypto people. So you had questions like, I hear there's an energy problem with Bitcoin, right? I don't get Bitcoin. How can I use my Bitcoin to buy a cup of coffee? I don't understand how that could happen. I don't know where I could buy Bitcoin and who holds it and how does this work? It's just, you're sitting there going, wow, we're talking about 2012, right?
Sure.
We're a decade, and I'm saying it. Those of us that have been in this industry or a part of it, who started reading the Bitcoin white paper in 2015, 16, 17, 18, whenever. This is such an elementary type of issue, and there was probably 10 minutes on, I don't understand who pays the electricity and how does the Bitcoin miner make any money? And the guy that was answering, I don't know his name, very smart person, very eloquent, very smart, smarter than me, but he was way too immersed in it, right? He was explaining how the block rewards work. Wow. And it was just you just need to say they sell Bitcoin sometimes, they mine the Bitcoin and they sell it sometimes when they need to raise funds to pay themselves, and they hodl it as much as they can. And there's a certain level of when they're profitable or not profitable. Some of them, the number's 12,000 a Bitcoin, anything above that's profit, some is higher, but it was just very rudimentary type questions. And, I was there to basically say, look, states need to lead because the federal government is in operation, Chokepoint 2.0, unbanking everything, coordinated efforts, U.S. senators encouraging bank runs, the seizure of Silvergate, saying that you can't, accept deposits from crypto companies, right? We're in a liquidity problem, but you can't accept liquidity from this type of business. It's insane. And so I'm saying to them, like, the states need to do it. And I said, think about this. If you're allowed to hold your Bitcoin at this bank or institution or your XRP or your ETH, whatever, and they guarantee that it'll be reserved at 100%. If I have 10 Bitcoins there, they have 10 Bitcoins there. Mm-hmm. You'll never experience a bank run.
Right.
Like, that'll be a problem. And every day, anytime you want your funds, you can have it. Like, that's what it's like. And I know that that's what the crypto people have to accept, because they're going to reject that. Right? The crypto people hold your own keys, not your keys, not your crypto. I get it. But the everyday people are not going to do that. I got news for you. When the CTO of Ripple, Stephen, he used to be, Stephen Thomas, mm-hmm. when he loses his keys, and he's smarter than I'll ever be.
Right?
He lost more brain cells in one night of sleep than I'll ever have. If he can misplace his private keys or whatever, John Deaton can. And I can tell you, average Joe can. So there are people who need that. They need that security. CZ of Binance, he's stated that many times. As much as our belief is in decentralization, before you can ever reach that level of decentralization and taking out the centralized intermediary, that's going to take a long time. That's not like 4 years away. I mean, we're in 2023, and at a state hearing today, people want to know, like, the basics. And they're not going to, be comfortable knowing that if they misplace their private key or their phrase or this or that, that their life savings will be gone, right? Mm. And so there are people who are willing to pay a fee to a central custodian, right? Yeah. JP Morgan with their Fidelity, with their high-end clients, right? They custody at Coinbase for them. Like Michael Saylor and them may be using Coinbase or someone else, I don't know, to custody some of it, and they pay a fee, right? Like paying rent. Guarantee that you're gonna, if I give you 10 Bitcoin, that I always have 10 Bitcoin, and I'll pay you X amount of bucks a month, whatever. And so they have to accept that's part of the process. But a guy like you, who's interviewed some of the biggest people in crypto, like, you're just going to go, wow. Wow.
Well, it sounds like, John, like, the major takeaways, there still needs to be education, and especially with both on the local, state, and federal level, the advocacy and the education. Here's what's happening. And to your point, we can't just go in with our advanced crypto knowledge and say, hey, and try to stuff it down their throats. It has to be a bit watered down. It has to be, put together as though it's a bit TradFi, but it's crypto at the same time, because they won't understand it.
Yeah. I mean, listen, one of the people who's a state senator in Maine, what do you think they brought up, Tony? They brought up, isn't this used for like criminals? You know what I mean? Isn't this used for like illicit purposes? Because if you have an individual wallet, like, they can't trade. So you have to educate them what you're saying. You have to have people go into these hearings and say the truth. The FBI, the CIA, NSA have all come out and said that they hope a terrorist used the Bitcoin blockchain, right? They can trace it. It's a public ledger. And so if you see suspicious activity, like, you could listen, I wanted to say to them, I didn't get a chance because they weren't asking me these questions, but I wanted to say to them, the government just sold some Bitcoin from Silk Road, and they're selling more. And so they were able to confiscate that through an investigation. And so, yes, we are early, and I would encourage people, if they really want to get an appreciation of what the non-crypto person is, someone who only hears Bitcoin, and it's getting bigger or it's risky, that's all they hear. Right. Or they hear they're all securities, or they hear they threat. And I told them it threatens the US dollar. It threatens national security. There are people who will fall for that because they're uneducated. And so we have to educate them.
And I guess to your point, John, it's good that these states are leading because right now on the federal level, it's a mess. And we can even talk about, I guess it's a good segue into the CFTC going after Binance, but in their suit saying Ethereum, stablecoins, and so forth are commodities. While on the other side of the token, you have the SEC issuing a Wells Notice to Coinbase saying everything's a security with the exception of Bitcoin. What a mess. I don't know how any innovator and entrepreneur can handle this nonsense, but what are your thoughts on the entire situation?
Well, my thoughts is that the mess is going to get messier because let's take and a couple things. Let's take CFT versus Binance, and they use language in there. And I brought this up in a Spaces once. They talked about how some funds, and we're talking about like $600 or like these kind of figures, might be being used by Hamas, right, or some other alleged terrorist organization. And I brought up a point, like, did you need that language are they relevant to the underlying charges? And they're not. Yeah. It's again to create the narrative, right? That's the pushing. Look, Binance and this cryptocurrency stuff is being used to fund terrorism. Now, we'll see if it proves that there was, but I mean, there was a comment of, well, you can't buy an AK-47 with $600 or something like that. But it reminded me, Tony, of the Ripple case. And it reminded me of how everyone not everyone, but people read that language about Brad Garlinghouse said he was long XRP while he was selling XRP, right? And it made it seem like it was fraud when there wasn't fraud. Right. They didn't actually allege it, but they use language and it inflames people. Mm-hmm. And, I read it because I'm just passionate about it, right? I love my family. I don't love XRP, right? I don't love Bitcoin. I love my daughters. So I'm kind of like agnostic to it all. And so I was like, well, sure. Is Elon Musk long Tesla? Yeah. He sells a shitload of it though, right? And so if I have 1 billion XRP and I sell 100 million of it, I'm still long. But so to me, it didn't inflame me, but it does inflame but I was a former prosecutor, and so I know how that language gets used and stuff like that. But the point being is that a lot of people were talking about the terrorism and the anti-money laundering and all of this. Now, what's going to be interesting is, does the SEC file a case against CZ and Binance alleging securities? Now, some people don't, oh, no, yes, they can. The SEC could come in, and believe it or not, Tony, talk about a mess. The SEC could come in and say that Ethereum was being used as a security, while the CFTC is saying Ethereum is a commodity, because any commodity or asset could be offered and sold as a security, right? Yep. So the SEC could come in and say, Oh, we're not saying that Ethereum itself is a commodity. We're not disagreeing with the CFTC. We're saying that the staking that was being used with Ethereum, that package is an unregistered security, right? And so it could even get further complicated where people just throw their hands up, and that's what's happening. Every week, do we hear about some exchange leaving the United States?
Yeah.
And that's what's happening. So I believe that, and you tweeted this stuff out as well, that we are seeing and witnessing firsthand the regulators crushing crypto to help the incumbents. So why does the NASDAQ, if everything is garbage, why is the NASDAQ going to custody crypto?
Yeah.
It's the NASDAQ, right? You've got the New York Stock Exchange, and you got NASDAQ, and you've got, Chicago Exchange and ICE and all those things. And so, like, I'm just saying is that if crypto is not here to stay, then why is Fidelity involved? Why is JP Morgan involved? Why is the NASDAQ getting involved? Why is the New York Bank of Mellon allowed to do custody? Why is these other major incumbent players involved? And so is it possible that we see the SEC go after Binance? Yes. In a separate case, do we see them going after Binance US? Yes. I mean, do I think that that Coinbase is the only exchange to get a Wells notice? No. Can I say that any other exchange has? No, I have no information. My belief is that Coinbase wasn't the only one.
Sure.
Now, whether or not the others have not yet received a Wells notice, but they're under investigative subpoenas, I'm very confident that they're all under investigative subpoenas, right? Whether or not they technically received a Wells notice, we don't know. Coinbase is a publicly traded company. So when they receive information that affects their stock and their shareholders as a public company, they have to disclose it. So when you see Brian Armstrong say, today we received a Wells notice, he's fulfilling his obligation of like letting the world know information and get it out there, because, who's shorting it, right? Before that announcement, like, you got to worry about all that stuff. Is there somebody shorting Coinbase because they got learned of the Wells notice first? So the way you eliminate all that is you don't sit on it and you put it out there. Privately held companies like a Kraken or something, they may notify shareholders, that are private. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, I don't know, but they don't have the same kind of obligation that Coinbase does.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And on the note of shorting, man, regarding the Operation Chokepoint, we're seeing the debanking of crypto companies. Elizabeth Warren launched an anti-crypto slogan, part of her campaign, and she contributed to some of the bank runs that we saw took place. It's a tough spot for a lot of crypto companies. I don't know how far they're going to take this debanking, but yet you have the big players like your JP Morgan. So what you're alluding to before, Citi still banking big crypto exchanges like Coinbase. You think we're in the eye of the storm here and there's more to go?
Yeah, I think that you always have to assume it's going to get a little bit worse or a lot bit worse, right? So that's why I said, maybe expect the SEC to go after not just Coinbase, but to go after the CFTC and Binance as well. I mean, Coinbase is an interesting company because some of this could benefit Coinbase in the long run. Like, I think about Coinbase and I think about, just as an investor, I own some Coinbase stock, right? I think either I should like back up the truck and buy a shitload of Coinbase for the long term, or they're going to zero. Like, in other words, if crypto's here to stay, other than Bitcoin, right? Then Coinbase should be a long-term winner, right? Because BitTrue or this exchange or that exchange, sure, they're smaller players, but if you have 500,000 customers in the United States, where are they going to go? Maybe they go to Coinbase, right? So Coinbase is interesting they could benefit long-term on some of this. I think ultimately what happens is that the SEC sues Coinbase. Coinbase stock drops more. There's even more pressures. There could be even claims of anti-money laundering. I'm not talking about fraud, but just like I was on a space with that short seller that was involved allegedly with Elizabeth Warren, Mark Cohodes or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And him and I got into a little bit of discussion, and we disagreed about some stuff, and then I agreed with certain things. And he was like, well, the government sees signature, and so if there was money laundering that went through signature with Coinbase or Kraken or Binance US or any of those companies, the shoe's going to drop. And my point was if something like that happens, like, we should be cautious, right? Like, I'm a Coinbase customer. Even if they have the best anti-money laundering program, right, and KYC policy implemented, there's always somebody who can create a legitimate looking company, become a client, and then use that proceeds to fund some kind of operation, right? Just think about that. I mean, they do it with JP Morgan banks, they do it with Citigroup, they do it with Deutsche Bank for sure, and others. But if the government really wants to go after a Coinbase or one of these exchanges, and you take a magnifying glass, you could find innocent mistakes that the government is punishing you for, right? And so that's the fear. And we were discussing that issue because he was like, oh, you shouldn't fight the SEC. And of course, my position for 2 years has been, fuck that, we got to fight. What do? You don't just close up. But as I've said before, Tony, we're going to, at some point, and it could be Coinbase, maybe I'm wrong, but we could see a BlackRock or a Vanguard. I mean, somebody big who comes in and all of a sudden they get a 49% share, right? Or they get 40% of Coinbase or this company. And then all of a sudden there's a little more, the government backs off more because the incumbents have come in and gotten more of the infrastructure, more of the custodial type plays, more availability to retail. I mean, ultimately, I think that's what's happening. I think we are seeing them, they dismiss you, they laugh at you, they fight you, and then they adopt you, right? That's kind of the thing. We're in the middle of the fight, and unfortunately, that's what we're going to see. I think it's gonna. I think it's gonna. We're gonna see these enforcement actions more and more.
And of course, two big cases the industry is looking at to help bring the balance of power back a bit is one, the Ripple case, and of course, Grayscale. Let's talk about Ripple because there were some predictions, and nobody can, of course, no one's here is Nostradamus. So some were predicting we could hear back from the judge by the end of March. But what's the timeline, as far as the window for when we may hear back from the judge in the Ripple case?
Yeah, listen, I got a little mad at somebody. Well, not mad, but like I got defensive for my friends, right? You make an educated guess on when a decision would come down. And so there was this thought that it should come down around the end of March 31st, whatever. And we did get the Daubert motion, which is March 6th. So the reality is, if you look at previous cases by Judge Torres, then there's been an occasion where she ruled the Daubert motion on experts came down, and an hour later, the decision on summary judgment came down. And then there was a case where it was 2 weeks between. And then there was a case when it was 30 days between. And then there was a case when it was 60 days, right? So what I've been telling people is that somewhere between March 6th and May 6th, we'll get the ruling, right? It could be today while we're talking, it could be filed, or it could be May 6th. Now, is it possible that it could go to June 1st? It's possible, right? We don't know. All we can do is say, if you look at her previous cases, this is the general timeline for the summary judgment decision. But people also got to understand, you tell me, Tony, I know you're not a lawyer, but as each day passes, doesn't it sound like this case has even more of a potential impact? Right. So for example, you've got Ripple filing those letters saying to her, look, this is what the Supreme Court said on a fair notice issue on one. And then there was another one where it said, look, this is what the judge in Voyager said about the SEC and the lack of clarity and all that. And so maybe she's adopting some of that stuff. I don't know, right? Maybe her decision is 7/8 of the way written. And she's just, doing a few details. Maybe she's only halfway through. I mean, I'm just guessing, and all we could do is I will be surprised if 30 days from now she hasn't decided. I would be genuinely surprised. I would be slightly surprised if we are, if she doesn't rule by the end of the first week of April, right? So today is April 4th. If May 1st comes and she hasn't decided, I'll be surprised.
And remind us, John, what's your predictions as far, and not going to hold you to any of this because nobody knows, but what do you think the outcome might be?
I think that the SEC loses summary judgment the way they asked for it. They asked for her to say that a past sell, present sell, and future sell of XRP is a security. They've asked her to say that XRP represents an investment contract with Ripple. I think that she rejects that. And I think that I don't think she's going to accept Ripple's argument on the blue skies pre-1933 case law. I think it's a great argument by Ripple. I told everybody the day it came out, it was brilliant and I hated it, right? It was like this appellate brief. And I think it has meat on the bone as it relates to the Second Circuit and the Supreme Court. But at her level, where she says there must be a contract in order for an investment contract, I think they're going to lose that argument with her. I hope I'm wrong. It's a good argument. But there are too many other judges who said, and if you read the Supreme Court decision, it says a contract, transaction, or scheme, right? So it says contract, transaction, or scheme. Doesn't say and. So it could be I think I think the judge is going to read it like that because other judges have. So I think that the real question is the SEC didn't give a lot of specific examples. So if I had to pick one winner, if you said who's going to win SEC, an outright win, SEC or Ripple, I would pick Ripple. Unopposed. A lot of people don't agree with me, but I'd pick Ripple because the SEC's theory is too overbroad.
Right.
And the SEC, when you read their summary judgment, they gave a few examples. They said in 2014, Ripple sent a brochure about XRP to about 100 people. She could find that to be what's called an offering. See, some people only think about the sales, but the law is you can have an unregistered security offering without a sale.
Interesting.
So that's an example where she could split the baby and say in 2014, that specific instance was an unregistered offering, and therefore that constitutes a violation. And then the question would be, does it go to like the fair notice and all that? And so my fear, Tony, is that it's going to be a jury trial on something, right? That's my fear, meaning that, but I would be genuinely shocked if she doesn't comment about the stuff we did. And when I say the stuff we did, I'm not just talking about me and XRP, I'm talking about all the amicus. I'm talking about Coinbase amici, Digital Chamber of Commerce amicus, Blockchain Association amici, where we all said to her, look, you have to say that the token itself is not a security, and you have to address secondary market sales. And so I think she will say something favorable to us because that's the law. And I think she'll follow the law that secondary market sales are not securities by themselves, that you have to be there has to be a specific analysis as each transaction. I think she'll distinguish the token itself is just software code, and that sure, it can be marketed and packaged as ones, but that the token's not a security. I think that she'll comment about the inconsistencies of the SEC and their behavior. But ultimately, the SEC didn't prove their case. And so they can't win outright. And so the judge could say that a jury must decide whether or not XRP holders acquired XRP for investment reasons or non-investment reasons, or whether or not we were engaged in a common enterprise with Ripple, or whether or not we just, as Jeremy Hogan said, that it'd be more on the third factor, that we didn't have an expectation of profit derived from Ripple's efforts. And so those are the factual issues that could go to a jury. So we could get a situation where she says denied to the SEC summary judgment, denied to Ripple. Here's some general stuff to consider, secondary market sales, all this, and a jury must decide these issues. Possible, right?
Well, yeah. Wow. So John, the SEC filed this lawsuit, and through their actions caused the loss of billions of dollars in value to XRP holders. Is there any repercussions to the SEC and the holders? I know this may be impossible to try to figure out, but that the SEC would have to, I don't know, make it right in some way?
Listen, obviously, just remember the SEC is a government agency. And so they have these immunities, sovereign immunity, qualified immunity. So, for example, if a police officer, arrests you and doesn't have probable cause, and, can you sue that officer individually? Usually no, right? Because unless you can prove that there was like bad stuff, right? He just made a mistake, right? Or it could be something bad where he sees a BB gun, a plastic gun on a kid. He thinks it's a gun and he shoots and he kills, right? You file a lawsuit, the cop is usually off the hook. And so, but you could be held for certain things. The problem is that it's a very high burden to overcome. You have to prove almost some kind of malicious intent. It's like a reckless standard. But here's the best example I can give people. Who the SEC sues is a part of the executive branch, and the executive branch has discretion. So there were people who were Bernie Madoff investors. They sued the SEC because they said, look at how grossly negligent you were by not bringing a case against the Bernie Madoff sooner.
Right.
You were given this whistleblower and notified here, and the judge dismissed those cases. Right. And so it's very high. Now, there may be a case if there was any type of conspiracy between government actors and others to favor one token over another token, or that if you can prove stuff like that, then there's a case.
So John, real quick, is that why the Hinman documents are so important in addition to other things?
Absolutely. And not just the Hinman documents, but emails that the Empower Oversight were trying to see, right? Give me all the emails to these founders and these people, and why did this happen and not happen? So, I'm not saying there is one or isn't one. I'm just saying that when people ask me, I would say if there's an investigation and it demonstrates some kind of nefarious conspiratory, right? Where one entity, a small group of investors, are given what's called regulatory capture, where they've captured the agency itself because of these agents are acting with these others, then you might have a great case. And it's something that I haven't ruled out. And it's something that I'm not going to rule out until I know more. But a straight up lawsuit against the SEC for being reckless and negligent, you just need to get a big burden. You know what I mean? It's a heavy burden. And there could be documents that support it. So I don't rule it out. Other people will rule it out. Oh, it's too difficult. If Bernie Madoff people couldn't do it, no one could do it. Well, what does Brad Garlinghouse mean when he says we'll be shocked? Right? What does Stu Alderodi mean when he says it was well worth the wait? Is it as bad? Is it as shocking as they think it is? Or, we'll see. So
we'll see. Yeah. Well,
these are great. They're great questions, and I know they frustrate people, but I have to give you the real answer. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Final question here, because I know you got to go. Yep. Grayscale versus the SEC. Any thoughts on how that's been going, and the recent hearings and so forth?
Well, I may have egg on my face because we'll see. Because I predicted before they filed. With the support of Joseph Grunfest, I was listening to him talk, and he's a smart guy and he knows a lot more than I do. And he was talking about, in his opinion, how clear the Bitcoin spot ETF denial was arbitrary and capricious under the law. And that because it was an arbitrary and capricious denial, in light of granting a futures ETF, that a person like Grayscale or anyone else could win. So if you go back to my tweet threads, when Kathy Wood was denied, her ARC was denied an ETF. When Anthony Scaramucci's Skybridge was denied an ETF, when Grayscale was denied the first time ETF, I was out there saying, fucking sue him, man. like that we have to go to court because they're never going to play fair. Like Gary Gensler puts on his shades, man, puts on the shades and says, deal with it. Right. He's like, fuck you guys. That's what he's saying.
Yep.
Right? And it's fine. He's a arrogant career megalomaniac bureaucrat. And he's like, there's nothing you can do about it. And so the only thing we can do about it is fight back. And so I think that Grayscale will win. When you listen to the hearing, the judges lean that way. Now, maybe they're faking us out, but they said to the SEC, you haven't argued that Grayscale's analysis is wrong. That's what the judge said. They said, not one time have you said Grayscale is wrong in their analysis. And everything you've just said equally applies to the futures ETF. Right. So, and then they went ahead and said this, Tony. They said, if we agree with Grayscale, are you going to grant a spot Bitcoin ETF? Or are you going to revisit your original futures ETF and remove it? Because the court can't force them. They could say it's arbitrary and capricious and rule in Grayscale's favor. But is it possible that Gensler and them would be like, well, we're just going to remove the futures and the short? It's possible. And so it's unfortunate, man. It's so unfortunate that the United States government is doing this. As you alluded to, when a sitting U.S. senator launches an anti-crypto as part of her platform, that's because she's confident that her constituents, she can sell that narrative of illicit criminal activity, energy consumption, right? Only the bad guys use this. It's going to threaten the US dollar. All the things that it unstabilizes the banking system. It's a threat. I mean, we're going to hear Bitcoin as a national threat, right? Is a threat to national security. We're going to hear all that, man. It's we went backwards.
Yeah.
Let's go back to 2018 when Bill Hinman said Bitcoin and ETH are not securities. And the biggest question was, well, what about XRP? What about Cardano? Like, okay, when are you going to bless those? And instead, we've just moving backwards. I mean, you've interviewed Hester Peirce, what, 2-3 times?
Yeah.
Well, when you interview her again, and maybe you've asked this and I missed it, but it's like, how frustrating can it be for her to sit back and think that in 2018, she was like, hey, there's this thing called a safe harbor, and we should get together and we should list some markers, right? Like say, just come out and give entrepreneurs the rules. If you're Ripple, you know what you can say to Ripple? We believe, whether it's right or wrong, we believe that you are not sufficiently a decentralized system if any entity owns more than 25% of the outstanding token. Whether I agree with it, you agree, Ripple agree, who gives a shit? Mm-hmm. But if that was the guidance, if it said that's one factor and how many nodes are out there and how many of this and how many of that, this is what sufficiently decentralized means. If you just laid it out and then say, you have 3 years to meet these markers. If you meet these markers, we declare you a commodity to go be governed by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. If you fail to meet these markers, we're gonna deem you still are selling a token as a security, and you must register it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just think about where we would be today, Tony. I hate to do that, right? But just think about that. So I know Hester gets criticized a lot by some people, and she gets praised by a lot some. And but I can't imagine how frustrating that has to be.
For sure. And even I think Chair Gensler has been asked about the safe harbor, and it seems like he hasn't read it or paid attention to it. He just gives off those vibes. He may have, but it's probably very frustrating for him.
If you asked me to predict, I would tell you that I would bet money that he's never read it. That he doesn't, he's not even going to consider it. The man in 2018 said that Ripple and Ethereum and the market needed clarity, and needed to give clear guidance. And then, today he says that it's been crystal clear since 1946. And so it's just insane. But all we can do is fold our tent and go home and let America fall even further, or those in this industry who view this as part of the future financial system is to continue to fight. Here's what I can tell you to everyone that gets discouraged. Gary Gensler will not be there 3 years from now. He will not be SEC chairman in 3 years from now. I mean, whether the Democrats get reelected or Republicans come into office, he's just not going to be here 3 years from now. And so regulators change. Look at how under Clayton and Hinman, ETH's not a security. Under Gensler, it appears it is. So that's the problem when you have unelected bureaucrats who have so much power. So anyways, sure. hopefully the next time I see you, man, our smiles on our face, right? And we're celebrating a good result from a judge who put at least a temporary stop to some of this madness.
For sure. John, appreciate you. Thank you. Always great information. Thank you so much.
Thanks, brother. Talk to you later.